In a quiet town surrounded by gentle hills, there stood an old convent with tall stone walls and ivy creeping up the sides. It was a peaceful place, filled with the sound of soft prayers, rustling leaves, and the ringing of bells that echoed through the valley. Inside those walls lived a group of nuns who spent their days in prayer, service, and silence. Among them was an elderly nun, whose life seemed as ordinary as the ticking of the clock in the convent hall. She had joined the convent many years ago, when she was still young, full of life, and eager to serve. Now her hair was silver, her step slow but steady, and her smile carried the calm of someone who had seen both sorrow and beauty in the world. Most of the younger sisters saw her as quiet and reserved, a woman who rarely spoke about her past. But there was something about her that made people pause, a kind of warmth that couldn't be described, only felt. Every morning she would rise before dawn, light a candle in the small chapel, and sit in prayer. The candlelight would dance on her face as she whispered softly, her words lost in the sound of the morning bells. She didn't seek attention, nor did she expect anything from others. But there was one thing she longed for deeply, though she never spoke of it to anyone. In the corner of the convent's main hall stood an old piano, covered with a white cloth that had long gathered dust. The piano had been there for decades, untouched except for the occasional practice session by the younger nuns who learned hymns for Sunday Mass. Most of them didn't know its history. They didn't know that once, long ago, the elderly nun had played that very piano with a passion that could move hearts. Before she joined the convent, she had lived in a small seaside town with her family. Her father had been a fisherman, her mother a teacher. Life wasn't easy, but music had always filled their home. As a child, she would sit by the radio listening to classical melodies, her fingers tracing invisible notes in the air. When she was 12, a traveling musician visited their town and offered lessons to children. She saved every coin she could and learned to play the piano on a borrowed instrument in the church. From the first moment her fingers touched the keys, she knew it was what she was meant to do. Her music wasn't about fame or applause. It was about emotion, about telling stories without words. People would gather outside the church just to listen when she played. Some said they could feel peace in their hearts, even on their hardest days. When she grew older, she was offered a chance to study music in the city, but her family couldn't afford it. So she stayed, played for weddings, for funerals, for anyone who needed comfort. Then came the war. Everything changed. The town was no longer filled with laughter or music. The piano she loved was destroyed when the church roof collapsed during a storm. Her father passed away soon after, and her mother fell ill. It was during those dark years that she found her faith more deeply than ever before. She turned to prayer, seeking a reason for everything that had happened. One day she walked past a convent and heard the sound of voices singing in harmony. Something inside her stirred. The peace she had been searching for seemed to live behind those walls. She gave up everything she had left and joined the convent. There she found a new rhythm: prayer at dawn, work in the gardens, caring for the sick, teaching children. Music slowly became a memory she tucked away like an old photograph. She thought perhaps that part of her life was meant to stay in the past. But one evening, as the sun was setting, she walked into the main hall and saw the piano for the first time. It was dusty and slightly out of tune, but still beautiful. Her fingers tingled as she reached out to lift the cover. Just one note, she thought, just one. She pressed a single key, and the soft sound echoed through the room like a whisper from her past. It felt like home. From that day on, whenever she was alone, she would quietly lift the cover and play for a few minutes. She played softly, just enough to hear, not enough to disturb anyone. It wasn't for performance or practice. It was her way of praying. Her fingers moved across the keys as naturally as her lips moved in prayer. However, not everyone in the convent understood this. One day, a new priest was assigned to oversee their small parish. He was strict and believed discipline was more important than emotion. When he heard someone had been playing the piano without permission, he was displeased. During supper, he addressed the sisters, reminding them that their focus should remain on prayer and service, not worldly things. The elderly nun sat silently, her eyes on her plate, knowing his words were meant for her. The next morning, the piano was locked. A small sign was placed on it saying, "For choir use only." She didn't complain, didn't ask for explanations. She simply bowed her head and carried on with her duties. But deep inside, it felt like losing a dear friend. The other sisters noticed her silence more than usual. She still smiled, still helped in the kitchen, still cared for the garden, but there was something missing in her eyes. The youngest among them, a cheerful girl who admired her deeply, once asked, "Did you really used to play the piano, sister?" She smiled faintly and nodded. "A long time ago," she said. "Before I came here. Will you ever play again?" The girl asked. Her smile faded slightly and she looked toward the hall where the piano stood, now locked and forgotten. "If it is God's will," she said softly. The young nun didn't understand why something so beautiful could be forbidden. To her, music was not worldly, it was a gift. But rules were rules and no one dared question them. Seasons changed. The convent went through quiet winters and bright summers. Visitors came and went. The elderly nun continued her days with grace, tending to flowers and helping the sick in the nearby village. She had grown weaker with time and her hands trembled more than before, but her spirit remained strong. Sometimes when she passed by the locked piano, she would pause for a second. Not to open it, not to play, but to close her eyes and remember. She could still hear the music in her mind, the melodies she used to play for her mother, the hymns she composed in secret, the lullabies she played for children during festivals. Those notes still lived inside her, even if her fingers could no longer touch them. Then one morning, a storm swept through the valley. The roof of the convent chapel began to leak, and the sisters worked together to move furniture and cover precious items. In the rush, the piano was uncovered for the first time in years. The cloth had grown heavy with dust and the air smelled of old wood. The elderly nun helped as best as she could, her frail hands steadying the edges. When the rain stopped, she stood in front of the uncovered piano, unable to move away. For a moment, the sun peeked through the clouds and fell across the keys. They looked golden in the light. The sight made her eyes well up with tears. She wanted to play, even for a second, but she knew the rules hadn't changed. So she just stood there, her heart aching with both longing and peace. The younger sister noticed her standing there and quietly came closer. "Sister," she whispered, "would you like to play?" "No one is here." The elderly nun smiled sadly and shook her head. "No, child. It's enough just to see it again." She walked away slowly, her steps echoing softly down the hall. The young sister watched her go, a deep respect growing in her heart. She didn't know it yet, but that moment would stay with her forever. What none of them knew was that fate had its own plans. That old piano would not stay silent forever. The world would one day hear the music that had been locked away for so long. But for now, the convent remained still, the sound of the wind moving through the corridors like a forgotten melody waiting to return. The days in the convent followed a peaceful rhythm. The bells still rang at dawn and dusk, and prayers still filled the air. Yet ever since the piano had been locked, something felt missing. The old nun carried on with her quiet routines, sweeping the garden path, tending to the herbs, and helping the younger sisters with chores. But there was a silence around her that no one could quite explain. The young sister who had seen her near the piano couldn't forget that moment. She often watched the older woman move slowly through the halls, her face calm yet distant, as if part of her lived somewhere far away. Once, while they were working in the kitchen, she gathered the courage to ask, "Sister, when you used to play music, what did it feel like?" The elderly nun paused for a moment, holding a piece of bread in her hand. Then she smiled faintly. "It felt like breathing," she said softly, "like speaking without words. When I played, it wasn't just sound, it was prayer." The young sister said nothing, but her heart tightened. She couldn't understand why someone with such pure love for music had been stopped from playing. Still, she knew the rules of the convent were old and unbending. Weeks turned into months. The seasons changed and life in the convent went on. But one day, a letter arrived announcing the visit of an important church official, a bishop who was known for his discipline and seriousness. The sisters were told to prepare carefully. The convent was cleaned from top to bottom, and everything had to be in perfect order. On the day of the visit, the sisters lined up in the courtyard, hands folded, eyes lowered. The bishop arrived with 2 priests, one of whom was the same strict man who had ordered the piano to be locked. The air felt heavy with formality. After the inspection, the visitors were offered tea in the main hall. As they sat there, one of the younger nuns was asked to play a short hymn on the piano. The priest gave her the key and allowed her to unlock it for the first time in months. The sound of the opening lid echoed through the room like a memory. The young nun began to play, but her fingers were stiff and uncertain. The notes came out uneven, and halfway through the hymn she stopped, embarrassed. The bishop gave a small nod, pretending not to notice, but the priest frowned. The elderly nun who had been standing in the corner felt her heart ache. Every part of her wanted to step forward and help, but she stayed silent. She knew her place. She knew the rule. After the visit ended, the piano was locked again. Later that night, during supper, the priest spoke firmly to the sisters. "Music is not for pleasure," he said. "It is for prayer and ceremony only. We must not be swayed by emotion or pride." The words stung. The young sister glanced at the elderly nun, who sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't defend herself or protest. She simply nodded and continued eating. When the others went to bed that night, she stayed behind in the chapel, lighting a small candle. She knelt in silence, her eyes on the flickering flame. She whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for peace. Her heart wanted to forgive, yet it still hurt. The next morning, the young sister found her in the garden, watering the flowers. "Sister," she said softly, "don't you ever get angry?" The older woman looked up and smiled. "No," she said gently. "Anger is like fire. It burns everything around it. I have learned to wait. Sometimes when the world closes one door, God opens another, even if we don't see it yet." Her words stayed with the young sister for days. But the truth was, the elderly nun did feel something deep inside. Not anger, but sadness. Music had been the one place where she felt whole, and now that space was gone. The piano was there, only a few steps away, but might as well have been 1,000 miles. At night, she would sometimes wake up and hear the wind moving through the hall. It sounded almost like distant notes, and for a moment, she would close her eyes and imagine she was playing again. The memory was enough to bring both comfort and pain. One evening, as autumn began to fade into winter, a traveling priest came to the convent for a short stay. He was younger and kinder than most. During supper, he spoke warmly to the sisters and asked about their daily lives. When someone mentioned the old piano, he smiled. "Ah, a piano," he said. "Music brings the soul closer to heaven." The older priest frowned immediately. "Music can also lead to distraction," he said firmly. The younger priest looked surprised. "Not when played with a pure heart," he replied politely. Even Saint Cecilia praised the Lord through music. There was a moment of silence. The elderly nun looked down at her plate, hiding the small smile that tried to form. It was the first time anyone had defended her love for music in years. Later that night, while everyone slept, she passed through the hall and paused by the locked piano. Her reflection appeared faintly on its polished surface. She laid a trembling hand on the cover and whispered, "Someday." The younger priest left a few days later, but his words stayed in her heart. They gave her a small flicker of hope. Not that she would play again, but that maybe what she once did had meaning beyond what others understood. Time moved on. The winters grew colder and her health began to weaken. The doctor who visited the convent told her to rest more, but she refused to stop working. She said she wanted to keep her hands busy. "If they stop moving," she said with a smile, "they might forget how to pray." The younger nuns adored her. They often asked for her advice or stories from her younger days, and though she rarely spoke of herself, she always found ways to make them laugh or think deeply. She had a way of turning even simple words into wisdom, but sometimes, late in the evening when the chapel was empty, she would sit in the last pew and hum softly. It wasn't a song anyone recognized, just fragments of melodies she had once played long ago. The echoes filled the silent space, soft and beautiful. It was her secret way of keeping the music alive. Then one morning, as winter melted into spring, a rumor began to spread through the convent. A youth choir from the nearby city wanted to visit. They were traveling to raise funds for a charity concert and hoped to perform for the sisters. The convent agreed to host them. The piano would be unlocked again for the first time in years. When the announcement was made, the younger sisters cheered, but the elderly nun only smiled quietly. Deep inside, her heart fluttered like a trapped bird. She didn't say a word, but that night she lay awake, listening to the sound of rain and wondering what it would feel like to hear the piano again. The day of the visit arrived with sunshine and laughter. The children and their teachers filled the convent with energy. The hall that had long felt heavy with silence now echoed with the sound of tuning and chatter. The piano, polished and shining once more, stood in the center. The elderly nun stood at the doorway, watching. Her heart was pounding, but she said nothing. When the first note was played, her eyes filled with tears. The music was simple, but to her it sounded like life itself returning. The sound carried her back to the days of her youth, to the sea breeze, the church bells, and the faces of those she had lost. But halfway through the performance, one of the keys broke. The children gasped and the teacher frowned. The music stopped. The hall went quiet. Without thinking, the elderly nun stepped forward. "May I help?" she asked softly. The children turned toward her, surprised. The teacher nodded. "Of course, sister," he said kindly. She approached the piano slowly, her wrinkled hands hovering over the keys as if afraid they might vanish. The broken note sat silent among the others. She pressed it gently, then adjusted something underneath, testing it again. The sound returned, faint but alive. "Would you mind testing it?" the teacher asked, smiling. The hall grew still. The sisters stood frozen. The rule was clear, she wasn't allowed to play. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she looked around, saw the young faces waiting, and smiled. "I suppose just one note won't hurt," she whispered. Her fingers rested on the keys, trembling slightly. She pressed down and a soft, pure sound filled the air. A sound that carried more than music. It carried years of silence, longing, and love. The hall was silent except for that note. No one spoke. And though it lasted only a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. That night, as the convent fell quiet again, the piano remained unlocked. And for the first time in many years, hope returned. Not just for the elderly nun, but for everyone who had witnessed that single, trembling note that broke the silence. The morning sun shone through the tall windows of the convent, lighting up the old wooden floors of the hall. The youth choir had come early that day, their voices echoing brightly through the stone walls as they practiced their songs. The once quiet convent was now full of life, laughter, and music. It had been years since the sisters had heard so much sound under one roof. The elderly nun stood by the doorway, watching the children tune their voices and practice simple hymns. She couldn't help but smile. Their faces glowed with excitement and nervousness, their teacher gently guiding them through each note. The piano stood at the front of the room, newly polished, shining softly in the light. Its keys looked inviting, and every now and then her eyes wandered toward it, though she quickly looked away, trying to remind herself of the rules. One of the children noticed her standing quietly near the back. With a cheerful grin, he waved. "Good morning, sister," he said. She returned the smile. "Good morning, child. You all sound wonderful. Would you like to listen while we practice?" the choir teacher asked kindly. "I would be honored," she replied, her voice gentle. The music began again, a sweet, lively melody that filled the hall with warmth. But after only a few minutes, the piano gave a sudden dull sound. The teacher frowned and pressed the key again. It stayed silent. "Oh no," one of the children said. "It's broken again." The teacher sighed. "It must have loosened during the move. Without this key, the harmony won't sound right." He looked around helplessly. "Does anyone know how to fix it?" The sisters exchanged glances. No one spoke. The elderly nun felt her heart stir. She had once fixed that very piano herself many years ago. Every curve of its wood and every note of its sound were as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She hesitated, then took a small step forward. "Perhaps I can take a look," she said softly. The teacher turned toward her, surprised. "You know how to repair pianos?" "A little," she said modestly. "I used to play long ago," he smiled. "Then please be my guest." The sisters froze. Some looked uneasy, remembering the old rule. The priest wasn't there that day, but still they hesitated to speak. The young choir member stepped aside, making room for the elderly nun. Slowly, she walked toward the piano. Her frail hands rested on the edge of it as she leaned down, peering beneath the keys. Dust had gathered along the wooden panels. She gently adjusted a loose string, testing the key again. A faint, pure note rang out, soft but perfect. "It's fixed," she said quietly. The teacher smiled in relief. "Thank you, sister. You've saved us." He stepped aside, motioning to the piano. "Would you mind testing the sound?" "Just a few notes to make sure it's all right." The room went silent. Every eye turned toward her. The air felt heavy, full of both hope and fear. The elderly nun's fingers hovered over the keys. Her hands trembled slightly. For years she had dreamed of this, touching the piano again, feeling its voice come alive under her fingers. She took a deep breath. "I suppose just a few notes won't do any harm," she said quietly, almost to herself. She pressed one key, then another. The sound floated gently through the air. It was like hearing a whisper after years of silence. The teacher nodded approvingly, but the nun didn't stop. Her hands, once still and hesitant, began to move with rhythm and grace. At first it was only a simple tune, a hymn she remembered from her youth. But soon something changed. Her fingers found their strength again, gliding across the keys with growing confidence. The notes blended into a melody so beautiful it felt like time itself had paused. The children's chatter stopped. The sisters stood frozen. The teacher lowered his head, listening in awe. The old nun's music filled the entire room, wrapping everyone in warmth and peace. Each note carried emotion, joy, sorrow, faith, and gratitude. Her face softened as she played. The years seemed to fall away, and for a moment she wasn't an old woman in a convent. She was the young girl who once played by the seaside, pouring her heart into every note. The piano responded like it had been waiting for her all along. Tears welled up in some of the sisters' eyes. Even the children felt something they couldn't explain. It wasn't just music. It was a feeling that reached straight into their hearts. When the final note faded, silence filled the room. The sound lingered like a prayer that refused to end. No one moved or spoke. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. The elderly nun lowered her hands slowly, resting them on her lap. For a moment, she didn't look at anyone. Her heart was full, not of pride, but of peace. Then the teacher began to clap softly. One by one, the children joined in. Soon the entire hall was filled with applause. The young sister who had always admired her had tears in her eyes as she whispered, "It was like hearing heaven." The old nun smiled faintly and shook her head. "No," she said softly. "It's only a song." But everyone there knew it wasn't just a song. It was something much greater, a moment that would never be forgotten. Later that evening, as the choir prepared to leave, one of the children's parents asked if they could record a short clip of her playing again. She refused politely at first, saying the music was not meant for fame. But the teacher insisted gently, "Sister, your music could inspire others. Please, just one more song." She hesitated. Then, after a moment of thought, she nodded. "Only one," she said quietly. They set up a small camera on a table, and she sat at the piano once more. The children gathered behind her, watching in silence. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to play. The melody that flowed from her hands was unlike anything they had heard before. It wasn't a well-known hymn or a famous piece. It was something she had written long ago, a song she had kept in her heart for decades. Every note seemed to speak. It told of the sea breeze she once loved, the faith that had carried her through hardship, and the quiet strength that had grown inside her through years of silence. By the time she finished, the children were crying softly. Even the teacher stood speechless. The camera kept rolling, capturing every moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright but calm. "Music," she said gently, "is not mine. It belongs to the one who gave it to me." The recording was short and barely a few minutes long, but it carried a kind of magic that no one could explain. The teacher thanked her deeply and promised to share it only with the choir members and their families. The next day, the children left, waving from their bus as the sisters stood at the gate to say goodbye. The convent returned to its peaceful rhythm, but something inside those walls had changed. The air felt lighter. The halls, once silent, seemed to hum with quiet energy. The piano remained uncovered, as if the rule that once kept it locked had lost its power. In the days that followed, the younger sisters found themselves humming the melody she had played. Some even tried to pick out the notes on the piano when she wasn't around, though none of them could make it sound quite the same. The elderly nun continued her daily routines, unchanged on the outside, but there was a glow about her now, a calm joy that showed in her eyes. She didn't talk about what had happened. She didn't need to. Then one morning, as she was tending the flowers near the window, the young sister ran to her, holding a phone with trembling hands. "Sister," she said breathlessly, "they posted your video online. People are watching it everywhere." The old nun looked puzzled. "Online?" she asked. Yes, the young sister said, smiling. The video of you playing. Thousands of people are sharing it. They say your music gives them peace. The old nun's eyes widened slightly, then softened. She looked out the window toward the hills where sunlight spilled across the fields. Then let it bring peace, she said quietly. That's all I ever wanted. From that day forward, the convent began to receive letters from around the world. People writing to say how her music had touched their hearts, how it made them cry, how it helped them find faith again. The elderly nun never asked to read the messages. She said it was enough to know that her small act of courage, sitting at the piano that day, had carried love into the world beyond the convent walls. And though she returned to her quiet life of prayer, the world outside had already changed because of her. The sound of her music had escaped the silence, and once it did, it could never be forgotten. The sun rose softly over the convent that morning, painting the walls with golden light. The birds sang outside, and the sisters moved quietly through their routines, but there was a new kind of energy in the air. It had been only a few days since the choir had left, yet their visit had left something behind. A memory, a spark, a warmth that lingered. The elderly nun went about her morning tasks as she always did, watering the plants and helping in the kitchen, but everyone could see a change in her. Her steps were lighter, her smile a little brighter. It wasn't just because she had played again after so many years. It was because, for the first time in decades, she had shared something that had been locked away in her heart. The young sister who had always admired her often found reasons to spend time with her. One afternoon, while they were folding laundry together, she whispered, "Sister, everyone in town is talking about you. The video of your music has been seen by so many people. They say it's the most peaceful thing they've ever heard." The elderly nun smiled softly and said, "If it brings peace to hearts, then I'm grateful. But let's not make much of it. I only played what was inside me." The young sister nodded, though she couldn't hide her excitement. "Still, you've touched the world, sister. Isn't that amazing?" The old nun looked thoughtful. "It's not me," she said gently. "It's the music. It always belonged to something greater than me." That evening, during their quiet supper, the Mother Superior announced that the church wanted to invite people from nearby towns to attend a small concert in the convent hall. The purpose was to raise funds for children in need, inspired by the music that had touched so many hearts. All eyes turned toward the elderly nun. She looked surprised. "Me?" she said softly. The Mother Superior smiled kindly. "Yes, sister. They would be honored if you played for them again. Only if you are comfortable." There was a long silence. The old nun looked down at her trembling hands, then around the table at the faces of her sisters. Finally, she nodded. "If it is for a good cause, I will do my best." The following week, preparations began. The hall was cleaned and decorated with candles and flowers. Simple wooden benches were arranged neatly, and a few seats were placed for visitors from outside the convent. The piano was tuned once more. Word spread quickly. People from the nearby village and even from the city asked if they could attend. They had all seen the video online, the one where the elderly nun's music had brought them to tears. Many came hoping to witness it for themselves, not out of curiosity, but because they wanted to feel that peace in person. On the day of the concert, the convent buzzed with quiet excitement. The nuns wore their best robes, and the smell of fresh flowers filled the hall. The elderly nun sat alone in her small room before the performance, praying in silence. Her heart was calm, though her hands shook a little. She wasn't nervous about playing. She just hoped that her music would mean something to those who came. When the evening arrived, the hall was full. People filled every bench, their eyes bright with anticipation. Candles flickered gently, casting warm light across the piano. The air felt thick with stillness, like everyone was holding their breath. The elderly nun entered slowly, her steps soft but steady. The room fell silent. She sat down at the piano and looked at the audience for a moment, faces of strangers, young and old, all waiting quietly. Then she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Her fingers touched the keys. The first note was soft, almost fragile. It floated through the air like a whisper. Then came another and another, weaving together until the hall was filled with sound. The music was slow and full of emotion, each note carrying years of memories and prayers. The people in the audience felt it immediately. It wasn't a performance. It was a story being told without words. They could feel the pain she had once carried, The loneliness, the faith, and the peace she had found through it all. The piano seemed to speak through her as if it had waited its whole life for this moment. Somewhere in the back of the room, a child began to cry softly. His mother put her arm around him, tears in her own eyes. The sound of the piano wrapped around everyone like a warm blanket. The young sister, standing near the wall, had her hands pressed together, tears streaming down her face. She had never heard anything so full of heart. The other nuns stood still, their faces glowing in the candlelight, their eyes fixed on the woman they had lived with for years but were only now truly seeing. The elderly nun's eyes remained closed as she played. In her mind, she wasn't in the hall anymore. She was back by the sea, where the wind carried her music into the waves. She could almost hear her father's laughter, her mother's voice, and the sound of children running on the shore. Every note brought those memories back, one by one, until it felt like the whole world was singing along with her. When she finished, the last note hung in the air, trembling like a breath that didn't want to end. The hall stayed completely silent for several seconds. No one dared move or speak. It was as if the sound still lived in the air, floating between them. Then someone began to clap softly. Another joined. Soon the entire hall was filled with applause, rising like thunder and echoing off the walls. But the old nun didn't bow or smile proudly. She simply placed her hands on her lap, looking peaceful. Afterward, people came forward quietly to thank her. Some spoke of how the music had reminded them of loved ones they'd lost. Others said they hadn't felt such calm in years. One woman said, "It was like hearing my soul." The old nun listened kindly, thanking them with gentle words. But when she returned to her room later, she sat in silence for a long time. She knew something inside her had changed again. For many years she had believed her purpose was to stay quiet, to serve, to fade into the background. But now she understood that even silence had its season, and that her music had been waiting for this one. A few days after the concert, the priest who had once forbidden her from playing came to see her. His expression was humble, his voice soft. "Sister," he said, "I owe you an apology. I thought music would distract from devotion. But what I saw that night, it was devotion itself," she smiled gently. "We all serve in different ways, Father. Some pray with words and some with sound." He nodded, his eyes wet. "Your music brought faith back to many who had lost it. You did more with those notes than I have done with all my sermons." She shook her head modestly. "It wasn't me. It was grace." The priest lowered his head and left quietly. From that day on, the piano was never locked again. It became a place of peace for everyone, a place where the sisters and visitors could sit and play hymns whenever their hearts needed comfort. As months passed, the video of her concert began spreading again online. Millions watched it. Messages arrived from people all over the world, from hospitals, schools, and homes where her music was played to comfort the sick and the lonely. Some called it a miracle of sound, but inside the convent, life stayed simple. The old nun still tended the garden, still prayed at dawn, still smiled at the children who came to visit. She never once saw herself as famous. She said fame was for those who sought attention, but peace was for those who sought truth. Sometimes when she played alone, the younger sisters would sit outside the hall, listening quietly. They said the music felt like light, gentle but strong, something that reached the deepest parts of them. One evening, as the sky turned pink and gold, the young sister asked, "Sister, do you ever wish you had played for the world earlier?" The old nun thought for a moment. "No," she said softly. "Everything happens when it's meant to. Maybe the world needed my music now, not then. And maybe I needed all those years of silence to learn what it truly meant to play." The young sister smiled. Understanding. The sound of the piano floated through the open window that night, blending with the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind. It wasn't grand or loud, just soft, honest, and full of life. And those who passed by the convent said that sometimes, when the sun was setting and the air was still, they could hear that music drift down the hill, a melody that seemed to come from the heavens themselves. It was said that no one ever forgot the sound of it once they heard it. Because it wasn't just music. It was faith, love, and the soul of a woman who had waited her whole life for the right moment to be heard. The morning light slipped softly through the window, resting on the old nun's piano. The air was calm, filled with that quiet peace that comes after something beautiful has already happened. Weeks had passed since the concert, but the memory of that night still lingered like a fragrance in the halls. Every morning she still rose before dawn, lit her candle, and whispered her prayers. She tended to the garden, helped in the kitchen, and listened patiently when the younger sisters spoke of their dreams. But now when she walked through the convent, she noticed something she hadn't seen before: hope. The younger ones carried it in their eyes. They had seen what faith could do when it met courage. The world outside the convent hadn't forgotten her either. Letters kept arriving from across the globe. Some came from schools where teachers played her music to help children focus. Others came from hospitals where patients said her piano pieces brought them peace during sleepless nights. Some letters were written by elderly people who said they had found comfort and courage through her melodies. The Mother Superior sometimes read the letters aloud during evening gatherings. Each time the old nun would shake her head gently and say, "All I did was play." One morning, a letter arrived from a well-known music foundation in another country. They wanted to honor her with an award for inspiring artists around the world. They also invited her to perform at a grand concert alongside young musicians who had grown up listening to her music online. When the Mother Superior showed her the letter, the old nun smiled faintly. "I have never traveled beyond these walls in many years," she said softly. "My steps are slow now and the world is very fast. Maybe it is enough that they heard me once." But the Mother Superior took her hand and said, "Sister, sometimes God asks us to step beyond what feels safe. Perhaps this isn't about you being seen. Perhaps it's about others seeing what faith can do, even in an old pair of hands." The old nun stayed quiet, her fingers tracing the edge of the piano key near her. She didn't answer right away, but that night, as she sat alone in the dim light, she thought about it. She thought about how her music had traveled to places she'd never been, and how so many people had found peace in it. "Finally," she whispered, "if it is His will, then let me go." A few weeks later, the convent made arrangements for her journey. It would be her first time on a plane, and though the younger sisters fussed over her like daughters, she stayed calm, smiling at their nervousness. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I'm only carrying a song." The flight was long, and when she landed, cameras flashed and people cheered softly as she stepped out. But she didn't see herself as someone famous. She greeted everyone kindly, thanking them with simple words. The concert was to take place in a large hall filled with thousands of people, musicians, reporters, and visitors from all over the world. The stage was grand with bright lights and polished instruments. For a moment, as she stood at the edge of the curtain, she felt small. She was used to the quiet chapel, the flicker of candles, the soft hum of prayers. But then she saw the piano. It sat under the light, waiting. She took a deep breath and felt peace settle over her heart. When she walked out, the hall erupted in applause, but she didn't wave or bow. She simply placed her hand over her heart, nodded slightly, and sat down at the piano. The sound that followed was unlike anything the audience had ever heard. Her fingers moved slowly, each note steady and full of life. The melody began like a whisper, soft, gentle, filled with longing. Then it rose, bright and full, like sunlight breaking through clouds. People closed their eyes as she played. They could feel something pure in her sound, something that came from a place deeper than skill. It was as if she was giving away pieces of her soul, one note at a time. In the front row sat a young boy who had been blind since birth. His mother had brought him because he said he could see colors when he heard her play online. As the old nun's music filled the room, he whispered, "It's gold, Mama. I can see gold." When the piece ended, the hall stayed silent again, just like that night in the convent. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of emotion, of gratitude, of something sacred that couldn't be explained. Then, as if on cue, the audience rose to their feet, clapping through tears. The old nun smiled, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she whispered, though no microphone could carry her voice. When she returned to the convent, the sisters G.